plastique ou passion physique. Sex tapis.
At 73, the shimmering lights have dimmed, but her story still burns with a fire that refuses to go out. Once the queen of the runway, twirling through Paris and Milan with arms raised like a goddess of motion, Pat Cleveland didn't walk, she danced. In the 1972nd, she wasn't just a model. She was a revolution. One of the first Black American models to be truly embraced by European fashion, Pat shattered color lines, turned heads, and transformed catwalks into art. But behind the elegance, behind the stories of Halston, Warhol, and Yves Saint Laurent, hides a devastating chapter. In 2019, Pat Cleveland was diagnosed with colon cancer. At the peak of her golden years, the woman once known for her unstoppable energy was now in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. Emergency surgery, financial stress, the horrifying wait for test results. For someone who had defied the limits of race and beauty, now came a new, cruel battle against time, against her own body. She survived. But survival came at a price. This isn't just a story about beauty. It's about resilience, about a trailblazer whose legacy was almost cut short, whose comeback was quiet but profound. Pat Cleveland is more than a model. She is a fighter. And this is the story of her most painful runway yet. Patricia Cleveland was born on the 23rd of June, 1950, in New York City, a place where dreams were as common as broken promises. Her mother, Lady Bird Cleveland, was a pioneering African-American artist and costume designer. She raised Pat as a single parent in Harlem and later in East Harlem, exposing her daughter to a kaleidoscope of creative expression and resilience. There was no silver spoon, but there was paint, poetry, and purpose. As a child, Pat was often sick. She battled severe asthma that kept her bedridden for days at a time. While other children ran in playgrounds, she lay gasping for breath, learning how fragile and precious life could be. That early proximity to illness would haunt her in ways no one could foresee. Yet, within the walls of that modest apartment, surrounded by sketches and scraps of fabric, Pat learned how to dream with her eyes open. Her mother didn't just nurture her talent, she weaponized it against a world that told Black girls they didn't belong. When Pat looked in the mirror, she didn't see beauty. Not at first. In the 1952nd and 62nd, beauty in America was defined by Eurocentric ideals, blonde, blue-eyed, and pale-skinned. Pat, with her high cheekbones, almond eyes, and mocha skin, was outside the mold. But Lady Bird made sure her daughter understood the deeper truth. Beauty wasn't about conformity. It was about expression, about movement, about being unforgettable. At the age of 12, a pivotal moment occurred. Pat accompanied her mother to a design appointment, and a fashion editor happened to catch a glimpse of the young girl. That fleeting moment would become a seed planted deep in Pat's psyche. Maybe she could belong in fashion. Maybe she should. Yet school was no haven. She was mocked for her race, her slim build, her strange looks. Instead of breaking her, it carved her. The rejection was a fire, and she would learn to turn every insult into propulsion. By her teens, she had developed a striking way of moving, graceful, exaggerated, almost otherworldly. It was as if her body was built to defy stillness. The civil rights movement raged outside her window. Pat was a teenager when Malcolm X was assassinated, when Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his dream, when Harlem marched for dignity. These events shaped her, sharpened her. She wouldn't just model clothes, she would model power, pride, and defiance. Her runway would become a stage, and her walk a declaration. I am here, and I will be seen. Her mixed heritage, African American and Native American, added layers to her identity. She didn't fit into one box, and that, ultimately, would become her greatest weapon in an industry obsessed with boxes. She wasn't just going to walk into fashion, she was going to break its walls down. What started as a sickly child in Harlem dreaming through asthma attacks would soon become one of the most mesmerizing presences on Earth's most prestigious runways. But before the fashion houses would know her name, the girl who once doubted her reflection would have to redefine beauty on her own terms. Pat Cleveland didn't chase fashion, it found her. But like most legends, the beginning was accidental. At 16, while riding the subway in Manhattan, she caught the eye of a Vogue editor. Her look, delicate yet commanding, classical yet exotic, was unlike anything the industry had seen. A test shoot followed, then another. Suddenly, Pat was in motion. But this was the late 1962nd. American fashion was still wrapped in whiteness. Black models were rarely featured, and when they were, it was often tokenized. Pat's early shoots were met with quiet resistance. She wasn't considered commercial. Agencies turned her away. Editors said she was too ethnic, but she didn't fold. Instead, she floated above the prejudice. Often literally, her walk had already become iconic. Her body didn't just move, it danced, glided, and shifted like liquid poetry. Her first real break came in 1969 when she modeled in the Battle of Versailles fashion show, a now legendary event that pitted American designers against French couture in a dramatic runway face-off. Pat was just one of several black models flown in last minute. What she did on that stage wasn't just modeling, it was revolution. The French, initially skeptical, were left stunned by the energy, rhythm, and raw brilliance the American girls brought. Pat, in particular, hypnotized them. Europe noticed. Paris called. Milan followed. While America hesitated, Europe embraced her. In the early 1972nd, Pat packed her bags and left for Paris, vowing not to return to the U.S. until a black model was featured on the cover of American Vogue. She kept that promise. For years, she refused American jobs. That exile wasn't about bitterness, it was about principle. If the country that raised her wouldn't celebrate her beauty, she would belong to the world instead. In Europe, she flourished. Designers like Karl Lagerfeld, Yves Saint Laurent, and Valentino fought to have her on their runways. She became Halston's muse, spinning down the catwalk in flowing silk gowns like a force of nature. Her presence was so ethereal that audiences often applauded mid-show. Pat wasn't just wearing clothes, she became the clothes, and for once, she was no longer too much. She was everything. Yet, her journey wasn't without barriers. There were moments backstage when hairstylists didn't know how to work with her texture, moments when journalists mispronounced her name or excluded her from coverage. But Pat turned every slight into spectacle. Her revenge was visibility. She wore turbans, cloaks, exaggerated collars, not to hide, but to amplify. She made herself impossible to ignore. By the mid-72nd, Pat Cleveland wasn't just a working model, she was a fashion oracle. Her style was magnetic, her energy contagious. She was the first black model many European audiences had ever seen, and she made sure she would not be the last. The little girl from Harlem had become a global sensation. But more importantly, she had cracked the mold for every black girl who came after. She turned exclusion into excellence, prejudice into poise. This was her rise. But what no one knew, what even she couldn't see yet, was how fragile that rise could be. Underneath the satin and strobe lights, time was waiting. And one day, it would strike back. By the mid-1972nd, Pat Cleveland had become more than a model, she was a phenomenon. Wherever she walked, the world stopped to stare. And she didn't just walk, she performed. Her arms would sway like satin ribbons, her body twisting and turning down the runway like she was interpreting a private rhythm only she could hear. She wasn't selling clothes, she was casting spells. Designers worshipped her. Karl Lagerfeld called her his muse. Halston gave her carte blanche on the runway. Yves Saint Laurent requested her specifically. Valentino once said she brought soul to couture. She was no longer the girl begging for a job, she was the center of the show. There was a reason why the runways of Paris, Milan, and New York waited on her. She didn't follow trends, she embodied them, and then danced them into something new. At Studio 54, she was a fixture, twirling in lame and feathers, often in the company of Bianca Jagger, Grace Jones, or Andy Warhol. But she never drowned in excess. While others spun out in the haze of drugs and indulgence, Pat remained grounded. Maybe it was her Harlem upbringing, maybe it was the discipline of someone who had battled sickness as a child. But while the disco era was burning fast and wild, Pat knew how to step back and breathe. Her editorial work exploded. Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, Essence, and Cosmopolitan all clamored for her face. She brought elegance, mystery, and a dynamic presence that photographers adored. Richard Avedon, Irving Penn, and Antonio Lopez considered her a living canvas. She could shift from divine grace to raw sensuality in a single frame. Even in stillness, she was movement. In 1974, Pat made headlines again, not for her modeling, but for her vow to never return to America until a black model was on the cover of Vogue. That year, Beverly Johnson finally broke that barrier. Pat returned, triumphant. She hadn't just kept a promise, she had helped push history forward. But even as she re-entered the American market, Pat's base remained global. She toured fashion weeks like royalty. In Japan, she was revered. In Italy, adored. In France, immortalized. At her peak, she wasn't just one of the top models in the world, she was the performance. Her influence spread beyond the runway. Young black models, including Iman, Naomi Campbell, and Veronica Webb, would later cite Pat Cleveland as the woman who showed them it was possible, that they too could be powerful, celebrated, and unapologetically themselves. In 1980, she married Dutch model Paul van Ravenstein, and together they became a fashion power couple. Later, she gave birth to Anna Cleveland, who would follow in her mother's footsteps as a model in the 2010 second, with a flair that unmistakably echoed Pat's iconic movement. But as the 82nd wore on, fashion shifted. The supermodel era was dawning. Cindy, Linda, Naomi, Christy, Pat, now in her 30s, no longer fit the new mold of high-gloss commercial perfection. She had been the muse of couture, not cosmetics. Her artistry was out of step with the era's obsession with marketability. Still, she refused to disappear. She walked when she wanted. She appeared in campaigns when it felt right. She wrote poetry. She painted. She became the spirit of an era that refused to die. Pat Cleveland had danced her way to the top of the world, but time, as it does with all legends, was beginning to whisper. Not yet, not now, but soon. In a world obsessed with symmetry, stillness, and sameness, Pat Cleveland was chaos in the most beautiful form. While her peers followed choreographed catwalks, she broke the rules, spinning, gliding, tossing her head back in bursts of theatrical joy. To some, it was too much. To others, it was genius. But to Pat, it was freedom. She didn't come from the school of rigid poses and emotionless glares. Her modeling was performance art. A Pat Cleveland runway moment wasn't just a presentation, it was a spiritual event. She would often improvise her movements, adjusting them to the rhythm of the room or the emotion of the garment. No one knew what she'd do next, and that unpredictability became her signature. She felt fashion in her bones, and that's what made her unforgettable. This defiance extended beyond the runway. In an industry that told black models to blend in, to tone it down, to act white in order to be palatable, Pat turned up the volume. She draped herself in turbans, sequins, oversized sunglasses. She celebrated her African and Native American heritage at a time when most were taught to hide it. Where others complied with the industry's narrow standards of professionalism, Pat exuded flamboyance, flair, and fierce self-ownership. Even her beauty broke the mold. She wasn't the blonde, icy supermodel stereotype. She had sharp cheekbones, rich brown skin, and an angular elegance that magazines often didn't know how to categorize. And when they didn't know what to do with her, she showed them. She didn't wait for validation. She demanded it through movement, through presence, through sheer force of will. Her politics were just as bold. Pat was one of the first black models to take an overt stand against racism in fashion. Her refusal to work in America until a black model appeared on the cover of Vogue wasn't just symbolic, it was personal. She knew what it meant to walk into casting rooms and be dismissed. She knew what it meant to be the only one backstage. So she refused to accept crumbs. She set her own worth and forced the industry to match it. She also pushed back against the sexualization that haunted so many models of her era. While many were coerced into submission behind the camera, Pat wielded control over her image. She posed nude when she chose to. On her terms, she flirted with the lens not out of compliance, but out of power. She was never the victim of the male gaze, she turned it back on itself. Fashion insiders didn't always understand her. Some called her too dramatic, too emotional, or too unpredictable. But these labels said more about the industry's limitations than about her. What they couldn't label, they feared. And Pat Cleveland refused to be labeled. Her style wasn't just aesthetic. It was protest. It was culture. It was joy, performed loudly in spaces that had long silenced women like her. She didn't just walk through doors that weren't meant for her. She danced through them, kicked them open, and invited others to follow. In doing so, she became something rare. Not just a model, but a movement. For decades, Pat Cleveland seemed unstoppable. Even as the decades rolled on, she remained a luminous force, reappearing on select runways, attending galas, mentoring young models, and reminding the world that elegance has no expiration date. But in March 2019, that momentum came to a sudden, terrifying halt. Pat was in Paris for a fashion show, a familiar city, a familiar role. But this time, something felt off. She experienced abdominal pain that worsened quickly. Within days, she was rushed to a French hospital and diagnosed with advanced colon cancer. For someone whose entire life was built on motion, she was suddenly immobilized. No stage, no lights. Just silence, pain, and the looming specter of death. The diagnosis hit like a freight train. She underwent emergency surgery in France, far from home, far from her support system. The financial strain was immediate and brutal. Despite a decades-long career, Pat didn't have the kind of health insurance or safety net one might expect for a fashion legend. Her family was forced to launch a GoFundMe campaign to cover medical expenses. The headlines were jarring. Supermodel Pat Cleveland battles cancer, needs help. For many, it was the first time they realized just how fragile the modeling industry could be, how even icons could be left unprotected. As she recovered, her body weakened. The vibrant, swirling woman who once commanded entire rooms with a flick of her wrist now struggled with fatigue, appetite loss, and the mental weight of mortality. The fashion world, so quick to celebrate youth and glamour, had gone quiet. The spotlight that once adored her now looked away. And Pat, for the first time in her life, had to ask, "Will I be forgotten?" But even in crisis, she never lost her grace. She gave interviews from her hospital bed, thanking fans for their support and urging people, especially Black women, to get screened for colon cancer. Her fight became advocacy, her suffering, a platform. She turned pain into purpose once again, just as she always had. Still, the comeback was not cinematic. There was no glittering return to the runway, no miraculous transformation. Her health remained fragile. Public appearances dwindled. She chose privacy over publicity, recovery over relevance, and while her daughter, Anna Cleveland, continued to model in her image, the industry that once celebrated Pat largely moved on. The truth behind the glamour had been exposed. Beneath the sequins and editorials was a woman aging, vulnerable, human. A woman who had given everything to fashion, but when illness struck, had to rely on strangers for survival. It was a cruel irony. Pat Cleveland had broken barriers for an entire generation. And now, she was left to fight alone. Yet, she didn't disappear in bitterness. She chose quiet strength. Instead of collapsing under the weight of betrayal, she reclaimed her time, her body, her story. She lived. And for someone who had danced on the edge of death, that was the loudest triumph of all. But the tragedy lingers, not in how she was defeated, but in how easily the world forgot. A woman who once set runways on fire now fights to stay in memory. And that, perhaps, is the harshest runway of all. Pat Cleveland never truly left the runway. Even in stillness, her presence lingers like a perfume in the air, a reminder of what fashion once dared to be. She didn't just model clothes. She modeled resistance, exuberance, and the radical act of loving yourself in a world that often refuses to. Her legacy isn't wrapped in magazine covers or vintage editorials, though she has plenty of both. It's in the fierce twirl of every Black model who steps onto a runway today. It's in the unapologetic expression of individuality that now defines modern fashion. Pat was doing what today's models call disruptive before hashtags existed. She wasn't a follower of trends, she was the disruption. Even as time faded her from the covers, it could not erase her from the blueprint. Naomi Campbell has credited her. Zendaya has channeled her. Her daughter Anna walks with the same fluidity that once mesmerized Paris. And still, her final battle facing cancer in silence, relying on public generosity, exposes a deeper truth. The fashion world doesn't always protect its pioneers, but that doesn't erase what they built. If anything, it makes their contributions even more sacred. At 73, Pat Cleveland is no longer twirling under lights, but she remains a lesson, a warning, and a celebration. A woman who danced before she walked, who broke barriers before anyone gave her permission. Her tragedy is real, but so is her triumph. And that, in the end, is the mark of a true